Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming here in this virtual space that we share together. And yeah, I'm talking today about land use, and here we are all in cyberspace. So that's it's a bit strange, and it's also a bit strange asking people's attention for something that's quite long term. In a time that we see so much very urgent short-term things happening. So my thanks to all of you to bear with me for the next 40 minutes and listen to my talk. One thing I want to ask Marsan, could you please warn me in a half hour that I've done a half hour, so yeah, I can then speed things up. As usual, some of you know me already, I tend to have too many slides, and this time is no exception. I have about 60 slides to go through in about a little more than a half hour, so that's way too much. But it's just to give you an overview, and I suppose the slides will be also made available, so it doesn't matter if you don't catch something. It's all something that's going to be published anyway, so just to start off there. Okay, ESPON SUPER. This is our team, super team. I'm leading it together with 7 other institutes throughout Europe, like most ESPON projects, and we try to be geographically balanced. And that was also very important here because we want to know about how land use is occurring throughout Europe, also from the ground. So we needed some local knowledge as well here. So on behalf of the rest of the team, yeah, welcome everybody. Yeah, we signed a contract about in February last year, and in 18 months we have for the project, we have to deliver quite a bit. We have to deliver 4 ESPON reports in 18 months. Right now we're on the draft final, we just submitted that. Evidence on land use developments using the latest data sources. That's mostly the Korean land cover data we've been using. We are more quantitative, how are things happening in Europe. Impacts of interventions. What are people doing to affect this land use change? That's a bit more qualitative. We're expected to deliver that. Urbanization practices. How's it happening on the ground in Europe? And looking to the future even. So how could this develop in the future? And we even have a land use allocation model that we used and created some scenarios, and I'll show you some of that today as well. And finally, because ESPON is research for policy, we're also working on impact. So we've been working very, very close. We have a Croatian partner, and so we've interacted with the Croatian presidency and got this on their agenda. Unfortunately, COVID has intervened there, but we're also very keen on making this very well known to policymakers and to academics. So again, thank you for your attendance. Now, the most recent thing is we delivered our draft final report. That's actually for ESPON the most important report because it's supposed to be complete now, the project, and we wait for comments from our feedback team, and we have to probably make some modifications, but in general, we're more or less done now. So I'm going to walk you through in this presentation what we've submitted. It's not online now. It'll probably be stuck and for the next few months, which if the other reports are indication, you'll probably get it at the end of June or July at the earliest. But this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm just going to follow the structure of the report so you understand what's there. It's not very long, 50 pages maximum. We put all the main information in annexes. So we have about 1,000 pages of annexes backing up this report, which is actually quite lean. So the first part, how did we approach these different deliverables which we asked to do? Well, we had to draw up a conceptual framework to explain that. And while we were doing it, first we decided to be clear about our terminology. Sustainability, what do we mean here? And we decided in this case to take a very broad approach. So we want to look at what we call the 3 Ps, people, planet, profit, or E's, equality, ecology, and equity. Economy, equality, and equity. But also look at the temporal balance, that what we do now doesn't negatively affect future generations. And in the end, we also looked at what we call the institutional sustainability, whether the policies you're implementing now have any longevity at all. So that's how we look at sustainability. And urbanization, we saw that a lot of documents that were asking for this kind of research were using words like sprawl and land take. And we decided that we want to reframe this to be more neutral, because nobody likes sprawl, and land take sounds like you're stealing. And we thought, no, we want to approach this from more of a spatial planning perspective. So looking at land conversion from one function to another. Practices, very important. How is land developed, this conversion process on the ground in Europe? That's a focal point of our research, and in European regions. If you know ESPON at all, their main slogan is territory matters. And what happens in one region isn't necessarily what happens in another region, and one-size-fits-all approaches probably can be a risky strategy. So we thought that was also important. So luckily, all that spelled out a nice acronym, SUPER, and this is more or less how, kind of our philosophy. Looking at our conceptual framework, there's a lot of data, quantitative and qualitative data on land use changes, and we're mainly looking at Korean land cover and other data to measure this. There's also in the academic explanations of why this occurs. There was a very nice review article by Polsat et al. In 2018, where they looked at all the different academic sources that tried to explain why land is taken in their terminology, but we would say why land is converted from non-urban to urban use. And you see here that some of the drivers are institutional and some of the drivers are, let's say, more organic. And in between these two is kind of a black box. You have a good idea of what the drivers are, you have a good idea of what the outcomes are because you can measure it, but how do you get from one to the other? Because these are both measured usually on the macro level, and the actual decisions are on a micro level. So how do we open up the black box? Well, we said we look at case studies, and we chose 10 places in Europe where we really zoom in, try to understand how land is developed, and look at an intervention trying to change that development process. So that's what we've done 10 times over. Now we're doing it in 11th, Switzerland. That's going to be added this summer. And then the final part of our conceptual framework is asking the question, this whole system, is this sustainable, yes or no? And there's been already some work on this type of stuff. Couch et al., Urban Sprawl in Europe, that book, the Urban Sprawl in Europe report by the EEA. They both look at the impacts of different types of urbanization and use the scientific literature, and we've done something very similar here. So that's kind of our approach. And now to go on to basically what we've done, the evidence. I'm just going to rush through this, and just to give you kind of a feeling of the type of work that we've been doing. Here's, for example, how agricultural areas are changing from 2000 to 2018. These are how shares of forest areas have been changing, evolving in the same period. Urban land use, how it's been evolving and changing. If you want to take that latter and say, well, how do we measure this in a really, let's say, objective way? We started out with the very famous Europe at Night photograph and compare two different years. And you see this is the change in the light, the increase in light. And some places there's some decrease, but mainly it's the increase. So you see these areas have all been, in terms of lights have been being put up. Non-urban, we've also looked and found that if you take the main three categories of urban, nature, and agriculture have been shifting back and forth, more or less. And about the same amount has been shifting from one as to the other. But if you zoom in on certain areas in Europe, you see that it's not necessarily balanced. Spain has been urbanizing much more agriculture, and Poland, it's been the other way around, which is quite interesting. You can ask, is this sustainable? That's kind of a hard question to answer on the basis of just the data. We've done some analyses, some preliminary stuff about how can we tease this out. One, for example, is looking at natural areas and seeing how much urban use is within these natural areas, because on the basis of land cover, and you see that some areas are more fragmented than others. Belgium, Flanders is highly fragmented, whereas, of course, Scandinavia and Spain are much less so. The big loser in the land conversion is agriculture, because we see that agriculture and nature, they kind of go back and forth, but most of the urbanization comes from agriculture. So the one land use of the main three categories declining is that. So we also produced a map of what did that land change into? And then you can see the territorial differentiation of this. And a lot of this changed to construction sites. Well, you don't know exactly what's going to happen from that construction site. Probably it's going to be urban, either industrial, or it's going to be infrastructure, or what we call urban fabric. But sometimes these construction sites get reverted back. We've seen that as happening as well. What we do notice, of course, is that urbanization is generally a one-way process. When we look at the data since 2000, that about 8 times as much land is converted into urban use than land from urban use to something else. So this, rightly so, makes urbanization a very important, let's say, issue for people concerned about sustainable land use. Because it's generally one-dimensional, one-directional. You don't get it back once you've changed it. We've also created a diagram of how land is urbanizing in Europe, and you see that half of the land use changes in Europe in the 2000-2018 period, where we have data on, was urbanization. So that's pretty significant, and especially considering that it's one way. Here's kind of the territorial spread of this, of how much artificial areas being changed in terms of growth. And you see that there's some areas which are urbanizing quite rapidly, and other areas where it's stagnant, and a few areas where actually you see de-urbanization. And in some cases, you do see actually buildings being demolished, but in other cases, it's other types of urban use that is going back to non-urban use. For example, construction sites which are never finished, and then they just become nature again because there was never any market. Also, things like mining and dump sites, stuff like that, is also in this category. So you see sometimes those things getting reverted back to other uses. Looking at who did it the most, at the member state level, you see the bigger urbanizer is Spain. It's hands down in terms of the change data that we have, the one urbanizing, and mainly in the first 2 periods up to 2012. Afterwards, it slowed down dramatically. other countries, for example, the UK and more Poland, you see that it picked up. And Turkey, I think, is there as well, where you see that the main urbanization growth happened after the crisis, which is quite interesting here. And I guess for all the people very interested in notions of urban sprawl and efficiency of, yes, are you urbanizing beyond your capacity? We've done some work on that. This is very, very tricky, and I'll explain more about this too, but we have produced maps which relate the amount of land use change to urban development per capita, and that gives you kind of a feel for areas which seem to be urbanizing either beyond capacity or urbanizing despite that the demand seems to be falling. For example, areas that are depopulating and still are gaining urban fabric, and there's quite a few of those. That's the purple areas in this map. And this is a really important caveat, because when you look at this map before where I showed, you see Belgium, and Belgium looks like it's doing really quite well. It looks like the population is increasing more than the urban development, so it seems quite sustainable. Maybe it's densifying quite a bit. So you think, oh, everyone should follow the Belgian example. This also contradicts what Belgium says is occurring in their own country. And why is this the case? A lot of it has to do with data. And so that's something where you have to be very, very careful when you make these kinds of maps. Here we see Antwerp. And if you look to the north part of the city, you see these very large areas which are kind of orangish. And that is where Corinne says this is urban. And that was in 2012. But we also have data at a very good fine-grained level for 2012 from the global urban footprint. And there you can see the actual buildings. And there you see that a lot of these areas that were coded as urban are pretty empty, which means that if more houses are built there, Corinne doesn't really capture that urbanization. So it just considers that densification in a sense. So this is problematic when you get to, let's say, very, very diffuse developments and Corinne land use cover coding. Now, we can't throw Corinne out the window because that's the most important data set we have European-wide, but we can show these kinds of caveats. Here's the Netherlands, for those of you familiar with the Netherlands. Here, there's much less of a problem. You see that the Corinne data set fits much better to the urban areas, and according to the global urban footprint. But here you see many times the opposite occurring. In rural regions, you have buildings which are still coded as agriculture. So if you build there, extra buildings, and it's not coded as urban, you'll still be called, oh, that looks quite sustainable because there's no urbanization occurring, according to Corinne. So yeah, these are problematic caveats, and the most we can do at this point is to signal them, because we can't, it would be a study unto itself, I think, to do this for all of Europe in a better way. So we just signal that. We also did cluster analysis of city types. I'm not going to go into really great detail, but it's showing what kinds of urban regions do we have in Europe, and you can see that you can sort regions in different ways according to their land use cover. We also did an analysis according to morphology, and we basically used the eyeball method, where we printed out maps like these and came up with a classification method and asked ourselves, what do we see here? And let's say the map to the right, you see two big globs of urban development. And you see a bit more polycentric areas outside. And then we tried to explain this, and we used a twofold analysis of a main structure and a substructure. And we're working on that. We haven't done all of Europe so far. We've done about a quarter of the regions, and hopefully by the end here we have a kind of a polycentric, monocentric, not quite what you would say sprawl, but a feeling for what kinds of morphology do these regions have based on what you actually see. And that, I think, would be useful when you compare to the data that we have, which is more quantitative about what are the actual population developments or land use developments. So that's one point. Now I have not so much time left, but so I'm going to have to zip through the rest. We've also done quite an extensive work on collecting examples of interventions throughout Europe. So we did that through searching, through our own networks that we bothered everyone we could find. We did an online survey, and in the end, we came up with a database. Here's some screenshots of our database. Over 200 interventions. And what we've also done is we tried to evaluate these interventions according to, are they successful, according to their own use goals, and are they sustainable? And so we have some information on that. Here are some examples. When you look at categories of interventions, we have two main, let's say, types are densification and containment strategies. And then we would say, you know, what is the intervention? For example, in Malta, just allowing from top-down national level that you can build extra floors on houses, legalizing that and overriding zoning plans. And then you can ask yourself, was the effect of this, is it successful, is it sustainable? And then compare that to, let's say, Luxembourg, which just provides information on, let's say, good infill sites. So we have collected these kinds of things and came up with our conclusions about sustainability and success. Came to I'm going to skip this. We came to an analysis of success factors, and about 41 of these, you know, what are good recipes for success? And a lot of them are things that you would imagine to be the case, like coordination. That seems to be positively related to success. What I found was kind of interesting is the whole decentralization, centralization debate. We found that there was about as much evidence that centralization is good for success as decentralization. So I think that's quite interesting that our empirical evidence also shows that there's no one governance recipe for success, and it's highly contingent. We also looked at European Union interventions. These are usually not to promote sustainable land use. Many times it's a side effect of other kinds of policies like cohesion policy or environmental policy, which indirectly impact land use. So we took a look at that to see if there are levers that the European Union can pull to make land use more sustainable. Yeah, and then another work package, it was delving into the case studies. How does this happen on the ground? That's the black box again. You know, how do we open up the black box? And so here are 10 case study areas. So we have a pretty decent geographic spread. We were also asked to be as varied as possible. So there's really no sort of consistency in terms of control groups, and no, we took very local examples and more multi-level examples and national frameworks and rural and urban. So we try to be as varied as possible in here. So it's very, very hard to generalize, but that wasn't necessarily our intent. Our intent was to really get a view from the ground. And again, we want to know what people expected here in this case study, how a certain intervention would change land use to be more sustainable. We contrasted that to the actual developments that we see in Korean happening, and we interviewed a lot of stakeholders to find out what they thought was happening in their region. And this is a very complicated figure, but what it does show is it shows on the sustainability triangle that most of the interventions in the end had an ecological thrust, that they were really oriented that way, whereas the expectations were a bit more in the middle. So this shows that, depending on what you think is sustainable, if you think sustainability is mainly ecological, then that's fine. But you see also that of these land use interventions, that there's quite a big, let's say, well, not say bias, but tendency, orientation to the ecological frame. And in some cases, that might have strained expectations of stakeholders. So you see in some cases, there's quite a wide divide between the actual intervention and what they perceived as the problem. Again, we contrasted the interventions to the actual developments. And just to look at one example, this is in Spain, where they had quite a bit of development around Valencia into a very fertile area, which had quite a lot of cultural heritage values as well. And it was widely considered that this was problematic. It was uncontrolled development, and that they should create a plan to intervene in this. So they did this through the spatial planning to protect this area. And originally it was quite ecological, but with talking with more stakeholders, they decided to link this intervention to more rural interests, more the economic side, and also the social side of the people actually working the land. And this seemed to be quite successful in gaining support. And they had some also innovations about creating a council to manage this area and a land bank. Okay, now pulling all these things together, we decided to look to the future, and then we ran some land use models. And how do you model the future? Well, we decided to create 3 scenarios. This came partly from the terms of reference, because they said we would like you to consider what zero net land take to 2050. That's the goal of the European Union, versus urban sprawl. So we said, okay, we'll do that, but we're going to reframe it using our own terminology, and we added a 3rd scenario as well, which is more of a polycentric clustered scenario. And so these are the 3 that we decided to work out. Compact city, containment, trying to control that urban development as much as possible from moving out into the open countryside, using, let's say, green belts, but also urban regeneration. The polycentric one is things like new towns, trans-oriented development, that sort of thing. And the last one is, I see Marsan, I'm 10 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. I'm actually I'm on target, actually. So it's going quite fast. And the last one is what we call diffuse scattered development. And this is very clear affinities with what you call urban sprawl. But we try to also frame that in the scenarios as something positive in all 3, that the government actually wants to promote this. And in that sense, we also said this has a lot to do with quality of life, individual liberty, being able to choose, where you want to live and that sort of thing, and probably less regulation and freedom of self to do what you want. So those are the three scenarios. If you take those three scenarios and you contrast them with the 3 dimensions of sustainability, you get a matrix, a 3x3 matrix. And what we first did is what does the academic literature say on this? Does this, for example, the diffuse urbanization, how does it score on consumption of resources or energy consumption or quality of life, et cetera, et cetera? And you see that sometimes there are contrasting studies about this, so you get a plus minus. It's not necessarily that they disagree. Sometimes there are different dimensions within this. So when you talk about environmental quality in compact, there's some good things and bad things. You get more noise pollution and probably more exposure to air pollution, but netto environmental quality probably is better because there's less car use and probably more bicycle use, that sort of thing. So then you can get plus minuses here. So this is a very synthetic table. Of course, we have the studies in our annex linked up to this, and we're still working on, every time we find a study, to update this table as much as possible. Okay, I'll skip over this. This is what I just said about that there's pluses and minuses to everything. And then what we did is we decided to put this into a model. And right now the JRC has created a model called Louisa. There's an open source version called Louisetta, which is what we used. And it has a module which predicts what the pressure is going to be for urban development in terms of GDP and population. And then it allocates land use according to what it thinks is suitable locations. And this is kind of how it works. If you look at 2012, that's the base map in the Louisetta, then it puts pressure on certain areas, and the second is suitability. In this case, it was in Belgium. There, so it's pretty diffuse suitability. It says it's good to develop generally near other urban areas and near infrastructure. Those are decisions made in the model. And then it creates a new map allocating that demand in a new 2020 map of land use. And we just keep on running this. It runs every 5 years, makes a new map, and we run it up to 2050. So the diffuse scenario, which is kind of the urban sprawl scenario, that is actually the business as usual scenario, or the baseline scenario in the Louisetta model, which is kind of a laissez-faire one. And it just says this is what would happen more or less if there are no policies, no land use policies, except for Natura 2000 and some very basic ones. And this is what it looks like at the EU level. Of course, those pixels are quite small, so it's hard to read. So I zoom in on, I don't know how many people are here from this region of Europe, but since I am, I'll zoom in here. Okay, here's the diffuse one. And if you take a look at the Netherlands, for example, you see in North Holland, around here, Hugowaard, in that peninsula, there's a lot of development up there because there are a lot of roads to build along, and there's open space, not so many restrictions. It also shows that models aren't necessarily good at predicting the future. They're kind of good at what-if scenarios. And you have to really suspend your reality a bit and just use this as a rhetorical device of, would you like this as an outcome? Now, this is our compact scenario. So you see what we've done is we've created some designation here. We've also said that areas near big cities are attractive, so they get most of the development there. And you see it's much more compact. It looks a bit more like the current land use. So I'll go back and forth here. And again, we're not trying to predict the future. What we want to do is have a discussion with policymakers about what is desirable, what isn't desirable. And we've done this already once in Brussels with a workshop about the diffuse scenario, when we showed what would happen according to the model if you just let everything go. And they came up with more qualitatively what they thought the impacts would be. And then we had a good discussion about whether or not this was desirable or not, and if undesirable, whether the European Union or member states should intervene in this. Assuming that we've gotten to the point where we think that this is unsustainable, the way land use is changing from one function to the other, and if you continue on this path or let everything go, like in the diffuse scenario, that you should really do something. Well, we've also created a handbook, and we've targeted two types of people for this handbook. One are the decision makers, the politicians, who can say, yes, we want to go for urban containment and avoid diffusion, or the officials who actually have to implement these changes, and they're more concerned about, well, how can we do this in an efficient way? Are there lessons to be learned from other regions where they tried to implement a certain policy and it didn't work? And they want to know those kinds of information. So we're trying to address both of these people, and this is very much work in progress, but it should be available extremely soon. Very preliminary. One is, we think that even though we can see effects of the economic crisis, we also can see effects of interventions. And many times that's a bit more on the basis of qualitative data. The stakeholders really did believe in the case studies that it was having an impact and changing development practice. So perhaps it's more long-term, down the road kind of thing. We also get a feeling that given the territorial diversity and all the different phases of development in Europe, that it's probably smart to be more place-based and territorial sensitive when you implement policies. And yeah, public authorities, they should take the lead in this. And we found that actually having a good strategy with a long-term goal can help with, let's say, getting people's attention away from, let's say, very urgent short-term things, and say, no, this fits into our long-term goal. Let's really make sure that we stick to our vision and implement at the short term some policies. And we also found that the EU could provide more leadership than it does in this case, that it should look at first to its own policies and whether those can become more sustainable or not, and then maybe also recommend to member states in terms of disseminating what seems to work and what doesn't throughout Europe, but also recommending to create visions on sustainable land use for the long term. So that was my talk, and I think I've done about 40 minutes, pretty much exactly.
Yes,
right?
Thank you. I will unmute you all for a second, and we can see if we can all clap. Let's try to do this experiment. Wait. Yeah. Did that work? More or less. Okay. Thank you very much, David. There were some questions that were being asked as you spoke in the chat. I noted down at least 5. So maybe if the people are still with us, we can follow them in the order in which they were asked. And I will ask then the person to unmute him or herself. The first one was more of a comment from Louis Dijkstra. Louis, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
So please
Louis.
show yourself and say who you are and ask the question, please.
Yeah, let's see if I can start my video. I've got a bit of a fake background here to avoid you seeing my bedroom. Okay, I have a large number of comments, but I'll keep it short. The first one is, I know when people use Corinne, they tend to use urban to refer to artificial areas. And so that makes it sound like you're writing about urban areas, whereas in actual fact, you're writing about all areas, all settlements, including rural. So I think that's a little of an ambiguity that might confuse people. And so you might want to think about how you phrase it. And then the other thing is, especially in light of zero net land take, in Europe, we have very different levels of artificial areas per capita, between countries, within countries. And I think it's a bit unfair to not take that into account. You know, imagine you were extremely sustainable and used very little bit of land, but it increased a bit. You know, is that a bad thing? And if you've used massive amounts of land and you're still increasing, you know, isn't that a different thing? And then in terms of, you know, you kind of dance around the term sprawl. You don't. It's quite important to think about the impact on the environment in a fairly concrete way. So, you know, are we saying this is going to increase energy use for transport? And if so, you know, how do you estimate that? And do you think that would be higher in large cities and small cities and rural areas? You know, I feel like we dance a little bit around those questions, but I'll stop there and I'll send the rest by mail.
Okay, thanks, Luis. David, if you don't mind, I would suggest we collect maybe 3 questions and then you answer them. Is that okay?
Or maybe I can just, since I have I'll do a very quick one, since Louis is going to send me an email anyway, and I can be more in detail. Yeah, that urban, we're going to be very clear about what we're measuring, and that's the only way you can do it. So sometimes we're using all the categories. Sometimes we want to just focus in what they call urban fabric. So it's sometimes confusing in Corinne. And the best we can do is basically be very, very clear about what we're measuring, and including caveats, for example, of what we did with the global urban footprint analyses, which is actually in our main report of the 50 pages. We found that was important enough to show up front and say that this Corinne data is very, very problematic, but it's the only thing we have at this level across Europe. So
the thing I think is critical is that you explain to people that you're talking about all territories, all of space, including the rural areas. Most people are going to hear you say the word urban, and if they are thinking about rural communities, they're not going to realize that Corinne classifies their sports facility or their house as urban, right? It's a bit odd that Corinne does that. So I think if you want to engage with other people, just using the term urban for anything that is built up is a problem.
Yeah, yes and no, because there's also the fact that you're building something, even if it's a sports facility, that's something that's being built, and that's part of, let's say, the ecological dimension of converting one land use to the other. So
sure, just don't call it urban.
Yeah, I think, yeah. It depends. Yeah, it depends. Yeah.
I just wonder,
it's a very complicated thing. I think we have to talk about this as well. Yeah. Are glass houses and mega stalls urban? Not really, but they are buildings. So yeah, this is it's a very complex thing, and the most at this point, what we're trying to do, because it's a pretty quick and dirty 18-month project, is to be at least clear about how we measure things. So that's our main goal. Yeah, no net land take as starting point. Yeah, you talked about the unfairness. One of our conclusions, of course, is going to be that territory matters, and that every area has their own starting points, and we're arguing against the no net land take. That's why we kind of rejected this as a starting point for the whole project. We said, okay, we understand that's why you want this project, but we want to reframe it. We want to reframe it as things changing. And I think this was one of the reasons why we won the tender. We said this fits in better with the philosophy of ESPON, that territory matters. And so that's our point of departure. And but right now the discourse is being set not by spatial planners, but by environmentalists, which I find quite interesting. Yeah, the last scroll, environmental impacts, work in progress. This happens to be harder because we don't have good harmonized data like we do for some of the land use stuff and population. So we do what we can, but what we can is quite limited in the 18 months. Okay, thanks.
Let's collect 3 more questions. So I would like to ask Victor Variu, John Bachler, and Yuling Yu to kind of unmute themselves in this order and ask the questions, please. So starting with Victor.
Hi, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. A very marginal question. If I understood that you presented a map about urban lighting using remote sensing data. Did you take into account the change of LED lights in the past years? Because, for instance, in Eastern Europe, lots of settlements has changed their urban lights to LED, and in the past years, big cities changed their lights. So it means that maybe urbanization cannot see via this remote sensing.
Okay, that's a nice caveat to that.
David, sorry to interrupt you. Let's collect questions because otherwise we will not manage to respond.
Okay.
So, Yuling, would you like to ask your question or should I read it out from the chat?
Yeah, so I noticed, can you hear me?
Yes, please go on.
Okay, so I noticed on the map, comparing land use and population development, a lot of the actually depopulating areas have a lot of land use increase. So that can only be concluded into 2 directions. One is they are doing things in an unsustainable way, not responding to the population trend, or if your model actually is not counting their efforts to de-urbanize, de-densify their cities, like converting post-industrial sites to urban forests and so on.
Okay, thanks. And last question in this round from John Bachler. John, could you please ask it? Hello.
Thanks very much, Martin, and thanks, David, for a really interesting seminar presentation. You mentioned at one point the trend towards greater urbanization since the economic crisis in the United Kingdom. You know, the UK has a bit of a peculiar housing market in several respects, but in 2010, 2011, and 2012, there was a sort of conscious decision made by national and subnational governments to use housing development in particular, also wider infrastructure, but particularly housing, as a tool for economic recovery with the objective of getting sort of quick wins. So a presumption in favor of what was called sustainable development, the question whether it was actually sustainable, sort of fast tracking housing development, infrastructure, eroding the green belt, we're using the green belt, and various tax changes to promote both supply and demand of housing. I wonder how specific that is to the UK, but using housing development as a tool for economic recovery, because we see a similar discussion at the moment in terms of thinking about economic recovery plans from the COVID-19 crisis.
Thanks, John. David, can you tackle those 3 questions, please?
Yeah, I'll do my best. Okay, the first one about the 2 Europe at night and the LED. Well, this was done by the BBSR, and I think what they told me is all they did is take the 2 satellite images and analyze those and contrast them with each other. So there's no anything taken into account here. It's just taking two images and looking at the difference. So make of what you will. If it turns out that there's a lot of urban development, but you don't see it because of different types of lights, maybe you'll see that in those maps. It's not in our final report because this was kind of just a teaser to jump off our analysis. Our analysis is using Korean data. The other one about urban use per capita maps. Yeah, that's something that we're really struggling with. And the knee-jerk reaction, of course, is to say, if you're urbanizing too much, then it's unsustainable. But then again, you have to look at what Lewis made earlier. A lot of these Eastern European countries, they had very, very extremely compact development. For example, in Romania, in Bucharest, very small apartments. And then you see in this era with declining population, because many are emigrating from the country, and yet urbanizing. But yeah, they're just kind of bringing themselves up to a certain standard and getting out of these tiny apartments. So who can blame them in a sense, you know? So that would look much different than, let's say, the development of other parts of Europe. And in some parts of Europe, you see that a lot of this is being driven not by the main houses, but by secondary houses. So that was the main thrust, for example, the Croatian case study. It's that a lot of the urbanization there, beyond, let's say, the capacity, was demand coming from second houses of people not living in the country or as vacation homes. So yeah, you have to be very careful about too quickly labeling something unsustainable just because of that. Just aside from the caveats we gave with the data, because the data is also showing a skewed picture as well. Yeah, and finally, the UK. That's an interesting one. I'd have to ask our team in Italy who've collected all those interventions. If there are other ones, I think several, I remember the Romanian case study, they also looked at housing as a driver for economic development, and many countries do this. But I know the UK has been extremely explicit in making housing quotas. And I guess your words seem to support our main conclusion that interventions do have effects, that there is something you can do to influence land use development. It's not just, let's say, a natural law. These are decisions made by humans, and we also use the word social construction. Land use development is a social construct. It's a physical manifestation of how we as a society operate with each other. So yeah, the fact that the UK government said stimulate the economy through quotas, and you see down the road more urbanization in this conclusions to say, hey, really be careful for what you wish for, you might just get it.
Thanks, David. We almost run out of time, and we have 4 more questions. So it's a big dilemma. So I would maybe ask David to pick one. There's one from Roberto on the sustainability triangle, one from Alex Vandel on whether all the 3 scenarios are unsustainable. Yahweh asked about health implications, and Sabrina about land cover transitions. So please choose your topic, and let's try to answer one more question.
Oh God.
Okay, 2.
Yeah. Okay, I like the scenario one because I think this is exactly the type of thing that we are shooting for. We were asked basically to create a happy scenario where everybody's happy and ecologically sustainable with zero net land take, and a sprawl scenario, boo, hiss, we don't want that as planners, and show that that's terrible. And what we've actually done is we've created 3 more or less, I try to write them ambiguously, that even these so-called diffuse scenario has some positive aspects to it, both in terms of the input, what people want and what they want to do, as the output. And so, yeah, of course, you could probably say that on balance, the diffuse scenario seems to score worse on many of the indicators than the compact one, but we're showing, I think, a bit more of a nuanced picture. And I hope that when you get down to the actual maps and you look at it and you see which kinds of land uses are being converted here, what's being sacrificed, are you building over a park to create apartment buildings instead of a farmer's field, those types of choices, I think that will enrich the debate, and we're hoping for that. But we don't know the future, but at most what we can do is create some stories about the future and have a debate with policymakers who maybe can influence the future.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we don't have time to answer more questions, but what I can do, David, and people who ask the questions, I will save the chat and send the questions over to David by email. And I think I know all of you who asked the questions, so yeah, he can maybe I will include your emails and you can have a conversation afterwards. So thank you very much for the excellent lecture, David. We really enjoyed it, and what a project as well.
Thanks.
It's super interesting. Sorry. And thanks for all the participants for joining and taking active part in the discussion.